Well, I want you to think about this a second. Jesus' miracles were documented by eyewitnesses that were there, and they wrote this down during the lifetimes of other eyewitnesses. His life, his miracles, his death, his resurrection is all documented by the eyewitnesses themselves.
Yeah, so that's very obviously false. There are no eyewitness accounts of, especially of the miracles. So when it comes to the miracles of Jesus, all of the information we have about the miracles comes from a way later date, like over uh 30, 40 years in the future. And
What's the range on those? Because I know that there's different dates for these. I mean, like, isn't the earliest one 40 years in the future, and then they move on to like 60 years in the future, something like that?
around there, yeah. So for the Gospel of Mark, which is commonly held to be the earliest gospel, that one would date to around the year 70, maybe a couple years beforehand, but still around the year 70.
And
And
Jesus was supposed to have died in 33
around
CE?
there.
Yeah.
Yeah, around there. So this is far in the future. And then the other gospels, Matthew, Luke, John. So Matthew may have been written around 80, Luke maybe a little bit after that, and John, there are different dates for John. That one is harder to date. But that one is like, any I've seen anywhere between, like, around 90 to like maybe the very early 2nd century.
So what I'm hearing is, while nobody knows exactly the dates that each of these things were drawn up, they do have a good idea in the order, and Luke and John are in that order toward the very end, several decades after the fact, and certainly not by the names of the people we've subsequently put
Right.
onto these gospels. So
Right. Yeah. The texts themselves are in fact anonymous. There was even debate in the early church about who wrote these and when exactly they were written, even what order they were written in. That is why different canon lists that we have, why different church fathers talk about them in different orders. Sometimes that's why they appear differently. Now, those are still like the main 4 gospels that all the church fathers were using. Even uh, some of the other sects were using them as well. But the thing is, those names are definitely later attached to those. Now, the early followers of Jesus probably would not have been able to uh, write that kind of Greek, and they would have been, probably speaking Aramaic anyways. So, like, even though some of them would have known Greek, I'm sure, they were probably not literate to that point. But the point of the Gospels being written later by people we don't know, the names that are attached to them do come from around the 2nd century. That's when we actually start seeing names attached to these. And the reason for that is because 100 or so years afterwards, when the supposed eyewitnesses were dying off, and there were other gospels popping up, apocryphal ones, they had to kind of decide, well, which ones are authoritative and how do we know? So, I mean, they had their own methods of figuring it out, but it was all like intertextual. So they were basing it off of, people that Jesus would have met in the Gospels, or that Paul would have met, or something like that. And they had different reasonings for each of those. But the names that are attached to them do only start coming in the 2nd century.
So for anybody that doesn't realize it, so you said that was Mark was definitely first, because I know there was some debate.
Yeah, there's always like some debate about it, but the Matthew first camp is very, very small in comparison. Now, every single school of thought, the major schools of thought at least, except that John's gospel was the last one written, even among like fairly religious Christians, I think. But when it comes to there's of course the most common one would be the 2 source hypothesis, where you start with Mark, and then both Luke and Matthew used Mark, and then also another source Q. And then there is, of course, the Farrar hypothesis, which starts with, which does start with Mark again, but then they have a different order of the Gospels being written without a Q, and then you have I forget the name of this one. I guess you call it like a tradition hypothesis, where even then you start with a proto-Mark, and then the synoptic gospels are expansions of a proto-Mark. And then that one is probably the smallest camp, but there's also the possibility of Matthew first, but that one is very unlikely. And I have been reading recently a lot about the synoptic problem, so hopefully I'll be coming out with a video one of these days about the synoptic problem.
And then
But
on top of these 4 gospels, we have like a library of other stories. And
yeah,
is this just like fan fiction, or where do the, I mean, because they're like, didn't Bart Ehrman write about 16 other gospels?
there are a bunch of other gospels. In many ways, they're not even really countable, because like church fathers will reference gospels that we just don't have access to anymore. They just don't exist. And sometimes they don't even talk about what they're about. They just kind of list gospels of certain places or groups. But we do
Are they
have
all these supposed to be, are they all referring to accounts of Jesus?
Yeah.
Okay, so I mean, does this tie into what Paul said about angels teaching about other Christs, or are we still talking about the same one?
Well, I mean, it would still be the same person that they're referring to, but the thing is, because of either gaps in knowledge or because of having a different theology, they all talk about Jesus in different ways, and about how special he is in different ways. My favorites are, of course, the infancy gospels. The infancy gospel of Thomas is just the best. I actually picked up a Greek copy of it just to, just to have fun with it.
My
And
favorite bit from that is where they ask Jesus how he feels about circumcision, and Jesus says that if God wanted you to be circumcised, you'd be born without foreskin.
I don't remember that one.
That was
I'll have to.
Thomas. If I remember correctly, that was the Gospel of Thomas.
Well, the Gospel of Thomas is different than the infancy Gospel of Thomas.
I
Uh,
thought I thought that was in the category of infancy gospels.
no. So there is an infancy Gospel of Thomas,
There's
and then there's just a Gospel of Thomas.
Okay.
Yeah,
Okay,
and
that was my confusion. So when I mentioned the Gospel of Thomas, they said that's one of the infancy gospels, and I was confused about that. But okay, that's how they categorize it.
yeah, no. So there are. There might be more, but I only remember 2 infancy Gospels off the top of my head. There's the infancy Gospel of James, and there is the infancy Gospel of Thomas.
Which
And
one does Jesus murder people?
that's the infancy Gospel of Thomas.
Okay.
Yeah. And then the Gospel of Thomas is kind of like a sayings gospel, a lot of questions and answers kind of thing. But the infancy Gospel of Thomas is where Jesus murders people. That one's a lot of fun. It's when he's a child. It's great. It's so funny. We do have a reading of that on our channel, and it is hysterical.
I should
So I read
watch that rather than just read it myself. I should watch you read it, because that would be a lot more fun. Can I put a link to that in
Yeah,
the
absolutely.
description?
Yeah.
Thank you.
So yeah, there are, and that was, of course, to fill up a gap in our knowledge about like the childhood of Jesus, because in the gospels that we have in the Bible right now, there is nothing about the childhood of Jesus. So gospels like that were written. The the infancy gospel of James was written primarily to I think it's the infancy gospel of James, that it was primarily written to talk about the Immaculate Conception. So the whole first part of it is about like how Mary was perfect enough to even conceive this child of God. Like she had to be in a completely untainted state, so she was like kept away in the temple for her basically her whole life. Very
No,
Siddhartha
that's not true, because I read
Gautama.
in the Quran that she was in a cave.
Yeah, something like that. But she was still kept away.
And the word of God cannot contradict the word of God.
Yeah, you're right. But yeah, either way, these So the ones that are currently in the Bible would probably be the oldest, generally speaking, but they still do not go back to any eyewitnesses.
Historians have tried to determine if something happened a long time ago. What historians use as a standard is how many corroborating documents and manuscripts are there backing up these events, weighed against how many refuting documents are there.
It's not quite that simple, because the further back we go in time, the less and less sources we have. So it's not just about finding corroborating documents. It's a lot more complicated than that, because a lot of the time we might just have like a lone reference to something, but that lone reference might match up with something we find in archaeology, not necessarily like a document, but evidence of like a battle or something like that. uh there are a lot of different ways that historians work these things out, and you also have to remember the quite a lot about the methodology, because there is of course the issue of something like provenance. So like where something was written, where something circulated, why it would have been important to that community, and who was writing it. You have to consider when this was written and when our earliest manuscripts of that thing were written, in the context of those. So there's a lot that goes into it. He has a very simplistic view of, and I'm sure this is probably just, if he's talking to the pulpit, right? He wouldn't give like a super detailed analysis, I guess, super detailed overview of how history is done, but that it is more complicated than how he presented it.
To put this into perspective, Cornelius Tacitus was considered the greatest historian of ancient Rome, first century historian from 2,000 years ago. Historians accept as historically accurate the writings regarding Cornelius Tacitus. You want to know why? Because there's not one, not two, but 33 corroborating documents and manuscripts for Cornelius Tacitus. That's considered a lot. The more manuscripts there are, the more historically believable it is.
And there are things that were said to have been written by Cornelius Tacitus, that were said to have been written by Flavius Josephus and so forth, that scholars have later said, well, yeah, Josephus or Tacitus wrote this body of work, but not this part,
That
because
happens sometimes.
earlier copies of this do not have this part. And this is what we call an interpolation, where somebody else injected this.
Yeah, that happens once in a while. Yeah, and it doesn't happen like all the time, but it does happen. So
And
that
it's
also
always under the questionable circumstances, when people like Josephus would be describing, Jesus as a man, if it is fair to call him a man because of all of the miracles he performed, all of that kind of, and things that a Jewish person of that time absolutely would not have said.
right, they wouldn't be calling him the Christ and all that stuff. Yeah. So there are questions of that. For example, we check different translations too, because sometimes a different translation can retain the proper reading, especially if they were copying from an even older manuscript. Because one of the hardest issues is figuring out what generation of copy you're working with. So like we have manuscripts that are like from the medieval period that say like in the margins, this was copied from a very ancient manuscript, and they actually retain a much better reading than something that was copied maybe maybe a few hundred years before it, but was copying from a later manuscript. So what we're talking about is the generations of manuscripts, and that is also hard to come to, and we have no originals of any of these.
Do you know that the number one source of ancient history as far as manuscripts go? New Testament of the Bible. There are over 24,000 corroborating documents and manuscripts of the New Testament of the Bible, weighed against 0 refuting documents, refuting any of them.
Okay, well, the interesting thing about this is that he when it comes to volume of manuscripts, he would be correct. We have more of the New Testament than anything else from the ancient world. But the majority of these manuscripts are from like the medieval period. We have, the thing is, if he wants to make an argument like that, then we would have better textual evidence for like the Quran, because the amount of differences in like early Quranic manuscripts and like even Quranic manuscripts up until the I think it's called the Cairo standardization, I think. And I think that was in the 1900s, maybe 1800s. I forget exactly when that was. The thing is, there is a stronger textual tradition for that with less changes. But the thing is, we've discovered quite a lot of manuscripts of the New Testament, and there are plenty of differences among these manuscripts. We have, for example, like the longer ending of Mark, for example. We know that was a late interpretation. We have the pericope adulterae. That's the story of Jesus and the woman taken in adultery. That has, in our manuscript evidence, popped up not just in John, where it appears now. It's popped up in different places in John, and it's even popped up in Luke. Like it's very clearly a later interpolation. But the fun thing about that one, the pericope adulterae, is that we also have like a side tradition that's being talked about through the church fathers that never references this story itself, but does talk about a similar story. And it's kind of, you kind of see it over time becoming a big fish story, where they're referencing the story, but it changes over time to become this bigger and bigger thing. And it's very much like, but not exactly similar to the pericope adulterae. And that happens for quite a few things in the New Testament. The pericope adulterae is just probably my favorite one. But when it comes to New Testament manuscripts, like I said, they predominantly come from the medieval period. But even if we were going with some of our earliest evidence, we still don't go back to the originals or even close to the originals. The closest one would be, I think it's P52 is their oldest one. And it's a copy of John, but it's like it's like a credit card sized manuscript. So and I think that's from like the mid 2nd century or something like that. So while it's getting there, it doesn't get us to the time of Jesus, certainly not to any eyewitness. And it is certainly far closer to when the Gospel of John would have been written. But that still doesn't matter. And when it comes to these accounts, again, they're not necessarily eyewitnesses. And one of the big issues is, of course, when if he wants to consider these things eyewitnesses, they disagree with each other on quite a few things. Now, I would say that when it comes to one of the things that I'll point out too is there are passages in our earlier gospels, so like Mark and Matthew, that say that that he came up, or that he resurrected after. It says after 3 days. He uses the Greek meta. He uses the Greek meta. So meta in this context would mean after. So after 3 days. That's how it pops up in Mark 8 and Mark 10 and in Matthew 27. That's how it pops up. But in Luke, one of our later ones, it says on the 3rd day. And he uses the dative for that, just to mean like on or in the 3rd day. So there is so that is like one of the things that is different. Those would have to be different days. After the 3rd day and on the 3rd day are necessarily different days. So while you can point to manuscripts all you want, and hey, that's great. I love looking at old manuscripts. It still doesn't get us to like corroborating evidence, just because there's a lot of them. And there are a lot of mistakes between those, a lot of differences among them.
So a manuscript is just stuff that people wrote by hand, and they're writing this after the fact. This is like hadiths. These are like people making comments on the scriptures.
Not
right?
quite. No, any manuscript. Well, you can have a manuscript of anything.
Okay.
It would be handwritten, yeah, but you could have a manuscript of anything. Like you can have a manuscript uh that's just a copy of a gospel, right? It's not a commentary; it's just a copy. Um, but you could also have
Which,
manuscripts of
but you
something.
get to put that in the list of the 24,000 manuscripts. Somebody
Yeah,
copied this down.
yeah.
How does that doesn't lend to
If it's just a
validating
copy,
that?
yeah. So when we um like you can use that to say like, oh, look how widespread Christianity was, by a certain time. That's fine. I think that's fine. Like if you have thousands of manuscripts from the from like the ninth or 10th centuries, you could say, oh, look how popular this belief or this text was during this period, and I'd be like, yeah, that is indicative of that, yes. um but it does nothing for the validity of the actual claims inside the text.
So technically, I can't prove to you that Jesus really did these things 2,000 years ago because I don't have a video camera for you. But also, technically, I can't prove to you that George Washington was ever president of the United States because I don't have a video camera of that either. But there's enough evidence from eyewitnesses that were there that it would be illogical to deny his presidency. And the very same thing applies with Jesus Christ.
So again, yeah, there are no eyewitnesses. Now, if you want to talk about the miracles, those are later to the story. Paul doesn't even talk about miracles. He barely even references any of the sayings of Jesus. Some of the stuff might be a saying of Jesus or something close to it. So when it comes to like, let's take something like the Gospel of Luke, right? So in the very beginning of the Gospel of Luke, he's telling you that he is not an eyewitness. He says that he's getting his information from eyewitnesses, but he himself is not an eyewitness. That's the very beginning well, Luke, it's in the beginning of Acts, I think. But it's the same author, Luke Acts. So when like Paul, for example, he has a lot of creedal formulas. So like he does talk about this idea that Jesus he died, he was buried, and then he resurrected. He uses cross language all the time. So like I'm pretty convinced that Jesus was crucified. But the resurrection is a much different story. Uh and this might be kind of a cliche, but extraordinary claims and all that require extraordinary evidence. Um so there's actually a Christian author. So his name is Graham Statton. So I have his book here, Gospel Truth with a question mark, New Light on Jesus and the Gospels. And in it, when he's talking about like gospel truth, he's talking about like the general idea behind the Gospels being true. That Jesus was this miracle worker, that he was the Son of God, all that stuff. He's talking about all of it, and he says definitively in this that no amount of historical evidence for the life and teaching of Jesus ever proves gospel truth. After all, some who saw and heard Jesus for themselves drew the conclusion that he was a magician and a false prophet. And then he goes on to say that the resurrection is not an historical event which can be investigated with historical methods. The historian can comment on what happened in the light of the disciples' experiences of the aliveness of Jesus, but the nature and reality of those experiences cannot be established by historical methods. So this is a Christian author. He even says like, yeah, I'm a Christian, but like there's nowhere near proof to this. And Ducko does say like, well, yeah, I can't prove it. Proof only exists in math. We're not looking for proof. We're looking for some substantial amount of evidence, it kind of goes along with whatever claim is being made. So if it's something small like a certain tradition or a certain holiday practice or something, that can be established with not as much evidence. But if we're talking about the resurrection of a dead guy, that is a much bigger claim. So it's going to require a lot more. So when it comes to even the resurrection, there are different ways that it was conceived of too. So some people did think that it was bodily, that it was a bodily resurrection. Some people didn't. Some people would even take the idea that we haven't gotten to this part in Blasphemer's Bible, but well, we definitely covered, the Enoch thing, right? How Enoch was kind of raised to God, right? Elijah, he also he also has an
Was
ascension
hoovered
scene.
up.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. So, but the difference between those guys and Jesus was that they didn't die. They specifically did not die. They just ascended. Um, so there are differences in the kind of the nature of those, but like there was still a lot of people that would disagree about what kind of resurrection it was, or was it an ascension. They
And in
disagree about.
both of those cases, as well as Jesus having to be resurrected before being ascended, we're talking about a physical heaven where physical beings go. And this is just an important point for people who want to make the distinction that was not believed at the time, that you had a supernatural soul inside your body, and that when your body died, your soul went on. These people thought that your body would get up again. You didn't have a soul, you were a soul.
Well, there's a little bit of a difference there, because like a lot of the Jews of the time believed, this is more true of like earlier Judaism, but they would have believed in like this grand bodily resurrection, where everyone would, and this is why it's in Matthew, that zombie scene, right, where they get out of their graves and all that. Um, the reason for that is, so I
And
think
also the Quran, where
right, yeah.
your physical body, and Mormonism as well, your physical body comes out of the grave to be taken by God.
Well, the thing is, that kind of taken by God, right? But it is supposed to come up out of the grave, and that's on the day of judgment, like the final day of judgment. So interestingly, there are even stories of Augustus, the emperor, being resurrected and walking around and talking to people. Um, so it is kind of interesting, the special pleading that's going on with Ducko. So there was the second century philosopher, Maximus of Tyre, and in his dissertation 27, he wrote about how there was this island where people go to hang out with Achilles and Patroclus in the flesh. And for the people that don't know, those were some of the big heroes of the Iliad. So there were people at the time who believed that they could go to this island and hang out with them. And here's specifically something even more interesting that Maximus says. I indeed have neither seen Achilles nor Hector, but I have seen the Dioscuri. So that's Castor and Pollux. They're often associated with ships and horsemanship. So yeah, I've seen the Dioscuri in a ship, those splendid stars who directed the vessel through the storm. I have also seen Asclepius. Asclepius is a god, primarily a god of healing. He says here, yeah, I've seen Asclepius, but not in a dream. I have seen Hercules, but when awake. So that is a much more first person account uh, of someone seeing these gods and saying that, like, other people go to this place to also see these gods. And he's saying specifically, this wasn't in a dream, this wasn't a vision, he saw them in the flesh, and he was perfectly awake for it. And I highly doubt that Ducko would ever take this account as serious. Um, he just would not, because it contradicts his view. Some like I said, some Christians even didn't believe in the resurrection at the time. Like 1 Corinthians 15 talks about the witnesses to the risen Jesus. But there is debate over like how these witnesses would have been. So that includes like, oh, he showed up to Peter and to Paul and to 500 other people. And I think the reason for Paul talking about this was, well, specifically, I think he lists Peter first. There were a lot of in the early church, especially after the death of Jesus, there would have been a kind of like how would you put this? Um, it was kind of like a Game of Thrones esque fight for power, like who is like the next person to kind of take over, and it was the next person to like take over the community, right? And like that's why you have this difference between um like more Peter focused texts where Peter is always like the victor, and like he's like in Paul's writings I think he's the first one to receive that kind of direct vision or revelation. He's the first one to see him. And in other texts it's like in the was it? Yeah, in the Gospel of John, so often called like the beloved disciple. He's not named, but I think that the beloved disciple in the Gospel of John is specifically a literary creation to kind of go against the Petrine community. So instead, so yeah, I'll just call it Johannine. This is a Johannine text where they're trying to prop up one, not really a priesthood, but I'm blanking on the word, but this one group over another. So like when Peter goes up to Jesus, who's already there with Jesus, hanging out with him. Oh, it's the beloved disciple. When they go over to see the tomb, Peter starts running first, but then the beloved disciple starts running, and the beloved disciple gets there first. So he's just there in the Gospel of John to one up Peter. So this is kind of like almost like a political work in some ways to prop up one community, one disciple over another, uh, because they believed his words over Peter's or anything from the Petrine tradition. Like some of like I think the Corinthians, for example, like they I think they didn't accept the idea of resurrection. They might have believed that you could only be saved if you were alive at the second coming, which is why Paul makes a big deal about how like there were a whole bunch of people that saw Jesus, some of which are alive and some of which are dead, but he like still says like, hey, they also receive this appearance, so they're also saved. So and yeah, there is like a whole lot of debate about how he would have appeared or how he was interpreted to appear, because it could be in a vision, could be physical, right? Um, so there have been different interpretations to that, and there's I think last time I checked there was still some debate about that. But either way, we're not dealing with like a single consistent viewpoint. We're not dealing with a single consistent interpretation. These people disagreed with each other, and like especially with the Gospels, they're very clearly literary creations. They don't go back to any eyewitnesses. Those were just that's kind of like church retrofitting.
He rose from the dead. He was documented by eyewitnesses that were there. We know historically that the disciples went from cowards to martyrs. Nobody dies for something they know is a lie.
Right, so they believed this thing, but that still doesn't make it accurate, right? So like let's take it this way. In Tibetan Buddhism, there have been many people who have self-immolated, which means they light themselves on fire. Now that was a big thing, right? Like I forget what was the protest? Was that in the 60s or 70s?
It was Vietnam War.
Vietnam War, that's right, yeah. So like during that period, there were multiple Buddhist monks who lit themselves on fire, and that tradition continued, and it's still going on today. A lot of the time when they protest, they do still light themselves on fire. They have like in I forget where in Tibet, but they do have like shrines dedicated to these people because of their martyrdom. And Ducko, they don't die for a lie. So maybe he should be a Buddhist. But what I'm really interested in doing at some point, I'd have to learn
What
Tibetan.
about the other guys, the Heaven's Gate cult?
Oh yeah, yeah, those guys, right?
Yeah,
So it's not about dying for a lie.
they
It's
were all going
about
to catch. They're all their spirits are all going to somehow hitch a ride on the comet Hale-Bopp as it was coming by, and be with Jesus that way. And so, yeah, it's utter horseshit. It's stupid. You got to be stupid to believe crap like that. But they believed it
yeah,
to their death.
yeah. So
Oh,
I'm
and they
not saying,
also castrated themselves before they drank the poison.
you know what, I would too. Uh, no. So the idea that, well, just because they became martyrs means that this thing is true has nothing to do with it at all, because we have other martyrdom traditions, and I really want to do a comparative um study where we look at the current martyrdom traditions in Tibetan Buddhism and comparing them to the early martyrdom traditions of Christianity. Because I feel like if we kind of are able to track out how their martyrs evolve over time in current tradition, we can more comfortably know like the tracking of martyr mythology in Christianity or in any other religious faith. So I think that that would be an interesting study, but I feel like I'd have to learn Tibetan for that.
That we know there was a mass explosion of Christianity. Tacitus wrote about this. The Roman governor of Bithynia, Pliny the Younger, wrote about this. Flavius Josephus wrote about this. Hostile to Christianity sources, historians in the first century in Rome, saying, yeah, these people are worshiping Jesus as a god, and it's growing and expanding and exploding.
Yeah, we saw that with Islam, with Mormons, and with the Baha'i faith, and many others. That's just the nature of cults, like all of them. That happens with all of them.
Right. Yeah. So it's again not indicative. Like it is again indicative of like, oh, look, this thing is getting more popular. That's fine. No one has ever disagreed with the explosion of Christianity in the second and preceding centuries, um, or in the successive centuries. No one's ever disagreed with that. That's always been a thing. Constantine made Christianity legal, not the state religion. So if anyone right now thinks that Constantine made Christianity the state religion, they would be wrong. He just made it illegal to persecute them. The state religion part comes with Theodosian, who or was it Theodosius? I forget which one. One of them was like
As I remember, it was for a time it was
Theodosius,
illegal to be Christian, and then it was legal to be Christian, and then 70 years later, it was illegal to be anything else.
Yeah. So yeah, Theodosius. It was Theodosius, not Theodosian. That was somebody else. So Theodosius made it the state religion, and he started kicking pagans out of their jobs and whatnot. And actually, I think that was happening a little bit beforehand too. But so that's where Christianity as a state religion started with Theodosius, not with Constantine.
If Jesus didn't rise from the dead, he was exposed as a fraud because he said he would, and the whole movement would die.
I have a question about that before I continue. Did Jesus say he was going to rise from the dead?
So in the Gospels, there are hints of it, but again, those come from a later time period where they already believed that Jesus had risen from the dead. The historical Jesus, that's a different story. We probably can't even say what he himself said about that. Our sources just don't go back to that, or they're not very good, or they are imbued with Christian creeds and all this stuff. So it's all coming from a very biased standpoint. So we can't even really tell what Jesus himself would have said about that. Now it does exist in the Gospels where he keeps alluding to his death, but this is actually one of the things that we can tell this is like a literary creation. Like in Mark 8:34, Jesus says, if anyone wishes to follow behind me, let him disown himself and carry his cross, and he will follow me. That would have meant nothing to the actual people, but because readers who are reading this 40, 50, 60 years on knew the story about Jesus' death and resurrection, uh, they would only mean something to them. It wouldn't mean something if this were like a real thing that was happening. Like if Jesus is talking to people, making this, and then talking about this cross language, they'd be like, "Oh, whoa, that's kind of weird. He's using that cross language. Why so brutal, man?" But it would have meant something to people later who already believed this stuff. So that is already indicative of a literary invention. Now, like I said again, like I do believe that Jesus was crucified. I do not believe that he resurrected. There is and furthermore, like even with like the miracles stuff too. Like I said, Paul doesn't he doesn't talk about his actual miracles. Like, he doesn't reference anything specific.
The only way secular history unfolds the way that it did is if Jesus actually really did rise from the dead.
The only way secular history unfolds as it did was if Muhammad flew to heaven on a winged horse. There is it's the same thing. It just doesn't hold up. Like obviously, like we got here somehow, but that's the job of the historian to kind of go all the way back, as far as you can at least. But at some
Would
point,
it be fair to say that the only way that secular history unfolded as it did was that you had this cult, you had this guy that got a little too uppity, or got his name too well known, for whatever reason he ends up being prosecuted by the Romans, and then and hung up on a stick, and we don't necessarily know that he resurrected. And maybe he didn't. It just there's indications that the way you read it, of the way I read it, where his followers run into Jesus after the fact, and nobody even recognizes him. Not even his mother recognizes him. But this is supposed to be the reincarnation of Jesus, and it reads to me as if people desperate to have Elvis still be alive after Elvis died. Because I remember when Elvis died, and everybody in denial of that. So it's the same kind of thing. So you build a cult, and then you start making up the bullshit excuses when it fell apart. And then you have this other guy has this weird vision and makes up a whole bunch of other stuff where he thinks that dreams are real. And now you have a whole religion.
yeah, I think that like the catalyst for the growth of Christianity would have been Paul. He went around, started a lot of churches. That would have been the catalyst for like Christianity as we know it. But the early cult would have been still Jewish. What's funny is that there are in like midrashic texts and like apocryphal works, like Esdras and Baruch. There are visions and appearances of former prophets to these people. They were somehow preserved even after they had like a physical death. So it's not that out of line to put Jesus in that same kind of uh, archetype, that same typology. So uh, I would say that I'm not sure with Ducko or anything, but unless you're willing to grant the same principle for those apocryphal works, then I don't really see where you're getting off by saying like this is definitely true of Jesus.
It's just another example of somebody trying to find any kind of confirmation and ignoring any rebuttal.
Unfortunately, that is true.
Thank you very much, Lawrence.
Absolutely no problem. Always love being on here.